Sarah Martinez had always been invisible. At 26, she had perfected the art of blending into crowds, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact. Working as a barista at the small coffee shop near the naval base in San Diego, she served hundreds of customers daily, but none of them really saw her. She preferred it that way. The morning rush was particularly brutal that Tuesday. Military personnel flooded in before their early shifts, creating a steady stream of caffeine-dependent sailors, officers, and support staff. Sarah moved mechanically behind the counter, taking orders, grinding beans, and steaming milk with practiced efficiency. Her long sleeves covered the intricate tattoo that wrapped around her left forearm, a design she kept hidden from the world. The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah glanced up briefly to see another customer entering. He was different from the usual crowd, taller, more composed, with an unmistakable air of authority that seemed to command respect without saying a word. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that came from years of training and experience most people could never imagine. Commander Jake Harrison had seen more than his share of the world's dark corners. At 34, he had led Navy SEAL operations across multiple continents, earned commendations that filled a drawer, and carried scars that told stories he could never share with civilians. Today was supposed to be a routine day, briefings, training schedules, and administrative work that came with his position as a team leader. He stepped into the coffee shop, noting the familiar chaos of the morning rush. The smell of espresso and freshly baked pastries filled the air, a welcome contrast to the sterile environment of the base. He had discovered this little place months ago when he needed somewhere quiet to think, somewhere away from the constant demands of military life. Sarah felt his presence before she looked up. There was something about certain customers that made the air in the room shift, and this man was definitely one of them. When their eyes met briefly, she quickly looked down at the espresso machine, pretending to be busy with maintenance. "What can I get for you?" she asked in her usual soft voice, not looking up from wiping down the counter. "Large black coffee, no sugar," Jake replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came naturally to him. He studied her for a moment, noting how she seemed to shrink into herself, avoiding direct contact. As Sarah reached for a large cup, her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing just the edge of something dark and intricate on her forearm. Jake's trained eye caught the glimpse immediately, and what he saw made him pause. It wasn't just any tattoo, it was something specific, something that triggered memories he had tried to bury. Sarah quickly pulled her sleeve down, but it was too late. She had felt his gaze sharpen, focusing on the spot where her tattoo had been briefly visible. Her heart rate increased, and she focused intently on preparing his coffee, hoping he would take his drink and leave like every other customer. But Jake didn't move away from the counter. He remained standing there, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had glimpsed. The design, the style, the placement, it all pointed to something he had encountered before, in a place and time that seemed like a lifetime ago. "That'll be $3.50, Sarah said quietly, still not meeting his eyes as she placed the steaming cup on the counter. Jake handed her a $5 bill, but instead of taking his change, he leaned slightly forward. "The artwork on your arm," he said carefully. "It's unusual. Mind if I ask where you got it done?" Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she counted out his change. She had been dreading this moment for years, someone recognizing the significance of her tattoo. "It's nothing special," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just something I got a long time ago." "Afghanistan?" Jake asked quietly, the word hanging in the air between them. The color drained from Sarah's face. She looked up at him for the first time, really looked at him, and saw recognition in his eyes. Not just casual curiosity, but the kind of recognition that came from shared experience, from understanding what that tattoo represented. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, but her voice betrayed her. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her past were suddenly feeling very thin. Jake studied her face, noting the way her breathing had changed, the defensive posture, the fear that had crept into her eyes. He had seen that look before in mirrors and in the faces of others who had been where they never should have had to go. "My name is Jake Harrison," he said softly, extending his hand. "Commander, Navy SEALs. And I think we need to talk." Sarah stared at his outstretched hand but didn't take it. The coffee shop continued its busy morning rhythm around them. other customers ordering and chatting, completely unaware of the tension at the counter. She wanted to run, to disappear, to go back to being invisible. But something in his eyes told her that running wasn't going to be an option this time. "I need to work," she said finally, turning away to serve the next customer who had appeared behind Jake. Jake stepped aside but didn't leave. He found a small table in the corner where he could observe without being obvious about it. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching as Sarah continued to serve customers, noting how she kept her sleeves pulled down and avoided looking in his direction. The morning rush began to thin out, and Jake noticed how Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly as fewer customers demanded her attention. But she was still tense, still aware of his presence in the corner. He had learned patience in his years of service, and he was prepared to wait as long as necessary. When there was finally a lull in customers, Sarah's manager approached the counter. "Take your break," he told her. 15 minutes. Sarah nodded and untied her apron, glancing nervously toward Jake's table. She considered slipping out the back door, but something told her he would only follow. Instead, she poured herself a small cup of coffee and reluctantly walked toward his table. "You're not going to leave me alone." "Are you?" she asked, sitting down across from him but keeping her distance. "That depends," Jake replied, setting down his cup. "On what you're running from." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Running from? I'm not running from anything. I'm just trying to live a quiet life." "The tattoo," Jake said directly. "It's not just artwork. It's a memorial. Specifically, it's a memorial that was done by a particular artist in Kandahar province. An artist who only worked with military personnel and contractors. An artist who specialized in tribute pieces for people who had lost someone." Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee cup. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Jake said gently. "I know that tattoo was done by Hassan, the old man who worked out of that little shop near the base. I know because I have one of his pieces too." He rolled up his own sleeve slightly, revealing a section of intricate tribal design mixed with military symbolism. "I also know that Hassan only did memorial pieces for people who had earned them through loss." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back angrily. "So what? So what if you're right? What does it matter to you?" "Because," Jake said quietly, "I was there too. And I've been carrying questions about what happened for 3 years. Sarah went very still. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that keep you awake at night," Jake replied. "The kind that make you wonder if you could have done something different. The kind that make you feel responsible for things that were out of your control." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The coffee shop hummed with quiet activity around them, but at their table, the weight of unspoken memories filled the space between them. "I can't talk about this here," Sarah finally said. "Not now. Not like this." Jake nodded, understanding. "When do you get off work?" 6, she replied reluctantly. "There's a park about 2 blocks from here. Sunset Cliffs Boulevard. Meet me there at 6:30. Please." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. She saw sincerity there and something else, the same haunted quality she recognized in her own mirror. "Why does this matter to you? And some people shouldn't have to carry them alone." Sarah's break was almost over. She stood up from the table, still uncertain. "I might not show up. I'll be there either way," Jake said. "And if you don't come tonight, I'll be back tomorrow morning for coffee." And the morning after that, as Sarah walked back to the counter, she could feel the tattoo under her sleeve seeming to burn against her skin. For 3 years, she had kept that part of her life buried, locked away where it couldn't hurt her anymore. She had built a new identity, a safe identity, working in this quiet coffee shop where nobody asked questions and nobody cared about her past. But now this stranger, this commander with eyes that had seen too much, was threatening to tear down all the walls she had carefully constructed. And the worst part was, some part of her wanted to let him. The rest of her workday passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she looked up expecting to see Jake again, but he had left after their conversation. Still, she could feel the weight of his presence, the promise of questions that demanded answers. As closing time approached, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could go home to her small apartment, lock the door, and pretend this morning had never happened. She could show up tomorrow and serve Jake his coffee like any other customer, keeping her walls intact and her secrets buried. Or she could walk to that park and face whatever it was that had been following her for 3 years. The clock on the wall ticked towards 6 o'clock, and Sarah knew that whatever decision she made would change everything. The invisible life she had built was about to be tested in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she untied her apron for the last time that day, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was tired of being invisible. Maybe it was time to stop running from the shadows of her past and face whatever truth was waiting for her in that park. The tattoo on her arm seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a permanent reminder of choices made and prices paid. And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah wondered if sharing that burden might be worth the risk of letting someone see who she really was. The park at Sunset Cliffs Boulevard was nearly empty when Sarah arrived at 6:45. She had changed from her work uniform into jeans and a long-sleeved shirt, her usual armor against the world. The ocean breeze carried the salt scent of the Pacific, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. She almost turned around 3 times on the walkover, her courage failing with each step. Jake was sitting on a bench facing the water, still in his military uniform but with his jacket removed and sleeves rolled up. He looked different outside the formal environment of the base, more human, more accessible. When he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, he turned and nodded. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as she approached hesitantly. "I wasn't sure either," Sarah admitted, sitting on the far end of the bench, maintaining distance between them. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below. The sound was rhythmic and soothing, a natural white noise that seemed to encourage conversation while simultaneously making it feel less urgent. "Tell me about Hassan," Jake said finally. Sarah's hands tensed in her lap. "What about him? What was he like? When you knew him, I mean." She was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "He was kind," she said softly, "gentle. He had these ancient hands that shook when he held his tools, but when he was working, they were steady as stone. He spoke English with this thick accent, but he understood everything, every story, every reason why someone sat in his chair." Jake nodded. "He did my piece in 2019, spent 4 hours on it, never took a break, told me stories about his granddaughter the whole time." "Amira," Sarah said automatically, then looked surprised at herself for remembering. She was studying to be a teacher. "That's right." Jake studied her profile in the fading light. "So you were there around the same time I was. What was your job?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "I was a contractor, cultural liaison and interpreter." "For which unit?" "Different ones," she said evasively. "I moved around a lot." Jake recognized the defensive posture, the careful non-answers. He had used similar techniques himself when civilians asked too many questions about his deployments. But this felt different. This felt like someone protecting not just classified information but their own sanity. "The tattoo Hassan did for you," he said carefully. "It's a memorial piece. Who were you honoring?" Sarah stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the cliff, her back to Jake. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face, and she crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her voice carrying back to him on the ocean breeze. "Why do you need to know?" Jake stood and approached her slowly, stopping several feet away. "Because 3 years ago, something happened in Sector 7 of Kandahar Province, something that resulted in the death of 4 contractors and 3 military personnel. Something that was classified at the highest levels and buried so deep that most people involved were transferred or discharged within months." Sarah's body went rigid. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The investigation concluded it was an intelligence failure," Jake continued. "Bad intel that led a joint team into an ambush. But the details never sat right with me. Too many questions were left unanswered. Too many people disappeared from the official record." "Stop," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was part of the rescue team," Jake said quietly. "We got there 6 hours too late. Found the aftermath. And I've been carrying questions about that night ever since." Sarah turned around then, her face pale and her eyes bright with unshed tears.
You were rescue?
You were the team that came for us. The word us hung in the air between them, confirmation of what Jake had suspected since seeing her tattoo. You were there, he said, not a question but a statement. Sarah sank down onto a nearby rock, her legs suddenly unable to support her. I was the only one who made it out alive from my team. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of relief and sorrow. After 3 years of wondering, of carrying guilt about arriving too late, he was finally face to face with someone who had been there, someone who could answer the questions that had haunted him. But looking at her now, seeing the pain in her posture and the careful way she held herself, he realized that getting answers might not be as important as he had thought. This woman was clearly carrying trauma that ran deeper than his need for closure. "What was your team doing there?" he asked gently. Sarah laughed bitterly. "We were supposed to be meeting with a local village elder. Intelligence said he had information about Taliban supply routes through the mountains. It was supposed to be a routine information gathering mission, but it wasn't routine." "Nothing was routine about that place," Sarah said. "The village elder was dead when we arrived, had been for days, maybe weeks, but someone had been using his identity to communicate with our command, someone who knew exactly how our intelligence network operated." Jake sat down on another rock near her, close enough to talk quietly but far enough away to give her space. "It was a trap. An elaborate one," Sarah confirmed. "They had studied our protocols, our communication patterns, even our personnel files. They knew exactly who was coming and when we would arrive." "How did you survive?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening ocean. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was a coward. I don't believe that." "You should," Sarah said fiercely. "When the shooting started, when everything went to hell, I ran. I left my team and I ran." Jake had interviewed enough combat survivors to recognize survivors' guilt when he heard it. "Tell me what really happened." "We had been in the village for maybe 20 minutes, Sarah began, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving a memory. "Marcus, our team leader, was getting frustrated because the elder's house was empty. Danny was checking the perimeter, and Lisa was setting up the communication equipment. I was supposed to be translating, but there was no one to translate for." She paused, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. "I was standing in the doorway, looking out at the street, when I noticed something wrong. The village was too quiet. In Afghan villages, there are always sounds: children playing, women talking, animals moving around. But this place was dead silent." Jake nodded, recognizing the tactical awareness that had probably saved her life. "I told Marcus we needed to leave. He said to give it 5 more minutes, that intelligence was rarely perfect, and we had traveled too far to abort without trying. But I had this feeling, this certainty that we were in danger." "What did you do?" "I stepped outside to get a better look around," Sarah continued. "And that's when I saw them. Muzzle flashes from 3 different buildings, all aimed at the house we were in. I screamed a warning, but the gunfire had already started." Jake could picture the scene in his mind, the chaos, the confusion, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. "I should have stayed," Sarah said, tears finally spilling over. "I should have run back inside and fought with my team. Instead, I dove behind a stone wall and called for backup on my radio. That was the smart play," Jake said. "If you had run back inside, you would have been killed with the others. But maybe I could have made a difference. Maybe if there had been one more gun, one more person fighting back, some of them could have survived." Jake shook his head. "We found 17 different firing positions around that village. Your team was outnumbered at least 4 to 1, and they had the element of surprise. Running back inside would have been suicide." "How do you know so much about it?" Sarah asked. "Because I've read every report, studied every photograph, interviewed every witness we could find," Jake replied. "Because I was the team leader who failed to get there in time to save anyone." Sarah looked at him with new understanding. "You blame yourself too, every day." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving them in the gathering twilight. The park had grown quiet, except for the constant sound of waves against the rocks below. "How long were you trapped there?" Jake asked. 4 hours, Sarah said. 4 hours hiding behind that wall, listening to my team die, calling for backup that seemed like it would never come. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those hours, imagining what it must have been like for her. The Taliban fighters were methodical, Sarah continued. They swept the building room by room. I could hear them talking, could hear them going through our equipment, and I just stayed hidden, too terrified to move, too terrified to help. You stayed alive, Jake said firmly. You survived to tell the story. That matters. Does it? Sarah asked. Because for 3 years I've been wondering if it would have been better if I had died with them. Jake turned to face her fully. Don't say that. Don't ever say that. Why not? What good has my survival done? I can't talk about what happened because it's classified. I can't honor my team properly because officially we were never there. I can't even get help dealing with what I saw because I signed too many non-disclosure agreements. Is that why you disappeared? Why you ended up working in a coffee shop? Sarah nodded. After the debriefing, after all the interviews and psychological evaluations, they gave me a medical discharge and a generous settlement, enough money to disappear and start over. And that's what I did, but you got the tattoo first. Hassan was the only person who understood, Sarah said. He had lost people too, family members, friends, neighbors. He understood what it meant to carry the names of the dead. Jake rolled up his sleeve again, revealing more of his memorial tattoo. In the fading light, Sarah could see names worked into the design, fallen teammates, brothers in arms who hadn't made it home. Mine honors the men I lost in Syria, he said. Hassan cried while he worked on it, said he was honored to help me carry their memory. Sarah looked at his tattoo, then slowly rolled up her own sleeve. Her memorial was intricate and beautiful, with 4 names woven into a design that incorporated elements of both Afghan and American symbolism. Marcus, Danny, Lisa, and Ahmed, the local interpreter who had been with them. Ahmed wasn't even supposed to be there, she said quietly. He volunteered to come because he thought the village elder might only speak Pashto. He left behind a wife and 3 children. Jake studied the artwork, noting Hassan's distinctive style, the careful attention to detail that made each name both part of the whole and individually honored. After Hassan finished it, he wouldn't let me pay him, Sarah continued. Said it was his honor to help me remember. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane home, and you've been carrying this alone ever since. Sarah nodded. The hardest part is that officially, my team never existed. There are no memorials, no ceremonies, no recognition of what they did or who they were. It's like they died for nothing. Jake understood the particular pain of classified losses, of heroes who could never be publicly honored. But hearing Sarah's story, seeing the depth of her guilt and isolation, he realized that her burden was heavier than anything he had carried. They didn't die for nothing, he said, and you didn't survive for nothing either. How can you say that? What purpose has my life served? Jake looked at her. This woman who had been invisible by choice, who had hidden herself away to avoid the pain of memory and connection. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I think we're about to find out. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The possibility that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The tattoo on her arm no longer felt like a secret shame, but like what Hassan had intended it to be, a way of honoring the dead by keeping their memory alive. But sharing her story had opened wounds that she had spent 3 years trying to heal, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. 3 days after their conversation at the park, Jake found himself standing outside Sarah's coffee shop at closing time. He had given her space, as promised, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't finished. Through the window, he watched her complete her closing routine with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Sarah noticed him waiting outside and felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Part of her had hoped their conversation would be enough, that sharing her story would somehow close that chapter of her life. But looking at Jake's serious expression, she realized he had more to say. She unlocked the door and stepped outside, pulling her jacket tighter against the evening chill. I was wondering when you'd come back. I've been thinking about what you told me, Jake said. And there are things about that night that still don't add up. Jake, I told you everything I remember. I can't give you any more details than what I already shared. It's not about more details, he replied. It's about details that don't match the official report. Sarah looked around the empty street, feeling exposed having this conversation in the open. Can we walk? I don't like standing still when we talk about this. They began walking toward the nearby marina, their footsteps echoing on the quiet sidewalk. The evening was clear, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt water and the distant sounds of harbor activity. What kinds of details? Sarah asked reluctantly. Timeline issues, Jake said. According to the official report, your team was ambushed at 13:47 hours, but the distress call didn't go out until 14:02. That's a 15-minute gap. Sarah frowned. I called for backup as soon as the shooting started. I believe you did, but someone in command waited 15 minutes before authorizing a response team. The implications of this hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Are you saying someone deliberately delayed the rescue? I'm saying the timeline suggests that someone wanted to make sure your team was completely eliminated before help arrived. Sarah felt sick. The idea that her teammates might have died not just from an intelligence failure but from deliberate betrayal was almost too much to process. That's impossible, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Who would do something like that? And why? Jake had been wrestling with the same questions for 3 years. I've been doing some unofficial research, looking into the backgrounds of everyone involved in the mission, planning, the intelligence gathering, the communication protocols. That's dangerous territory, Sarah warned. If this was really a deliberate setup, then asking questions could put you at risk. I'm willing to take that risk, Jake said, but I need your help. Sarah shook her head immediately. No, absolutely not. I've spent 3 years building a life where I don't have to think about any of this. I'm not going to throw that away to chase conspiracy theories. They're not theories, Jake said firmly. 3 months after your mission, the intelligence officer who provided the information about the village elder was transferred to a cushy desk job at the Pentagon. The communications officer who delayed the response call was promoted. The commanding officer who approved the mission took early retirement with full benefits. Sarah's hands were shaking now. Stop. I can't hear this. And the village elder who was supposedly going to give you information? I found records showing he had been dead for 6 months before your team was sent to meet him. Stop, Sarah said more forcefully, drawing the attention of a couple walking by. She lowered her voice, but her intensity remained. Even if you're right, even if this was all planned, what difference does it make now? My team is still dead. I'm still broken, and digging into this won't bring them back. Jake moved closer, his voice gentle but urgent. But it might prevent it from happening to someone else. Sarah stared at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, the same kind of focused intensity that had probably made him an effective SEAL commander. But she also saw something else, a man carrying his own guilt, looking for a way to make sense of a senseless situation. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said quietly. Help me understand what really happened. You were the only witness who survived. You saw things, heard things that weren't in your debriefing reports. Because I was ordered not to include them, Sarah said. I was told that certain details were not relevant to the investigation. Jake's eyes sharpened. What details? Sarah began walking again, needing movement to deal with the anxiety building in her chest. There was a second radio frequency? What do you mean? During the firefight, while I was hiding behind that wall, I heard radio chatter that wasn't on our standard communication channel. Someone was coordinating the attack, giving instructions in English. Jake stopped walking. English? Not Pashto or Dari? Perfect English. American English. Someone was telling the fighters where to position themselves, when to advance, when to fall back. It was like they had real-time intelligence about our location and movements. Did you report this? I tried to. But during my debriefing, when I mentioned the English-speaking coordinator, I was told that trauma can cause auditory hallucinations, that what I thought I heard was probably just fragments of our team's own radio communications, mixed with the stress of the situation. Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest. They made you doubt your own memories. They were very good at it, Sarah said bitterly. By the end of the psychological evaluations, I was questioning everything I remembered about that day. They had reached the marina, and Sarah found herself drawn to the water. She sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, watching the boats rock gently in their slips. Jake sat beside her, close enough to talk quietly. "There's something else," Sarah said after a long pause. "Something I've never told anyone." Jake waited, sensing that this was important. "The night before the mission, I had dinner with Marcus. We were reviewing the intelligence reports and he was worried. Said something felt off about the whole thing." "What kind of off?" "The intelligence was too specific, too detailed. Usually, when we got information from local sources, it was vague and had to be verified through multiple channels. But this intel about the village elder came with precise timing, exact locations, even details about his daily routine." Jake nodded, recognizing the tactical concern. "Good intelligence officers are suspicious of intelligence that's too good. Marcus wanted to request additional reconnaissance before we went in, but he was overruled by someone higher up the chain, told that the window of opportunity was narrow and we needed to act immediately." "Who overruled him?" Sarah was quiet for a moment and Jake could see her internal struggle. Finally, she spoke a name that made Jake's blood run cold. "Colonel Richard Hawthorne." Jake knew the name. Colonel Hawthorne had been involved in intelligence operations throughout Afghanistan and Iraq, with a reputation for aggressive tactics and results that sometimes came at a high cost. He had also been one of the officers who had questioned Jake extensively after the failed rescue mission. "Hawthorne was the one who briefed you?" "Not directly, but Marcus mentioned his name several times. Said Hawthorne was pushing hard for this particular mission, that it came with special authorization from Theater Command." Jake was beginning to see the outline of something larger and more sinister than a simple intelligence failure. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." She nodded, though she looked apprehensive. "Was there anything about your team's skill set or knowledge that might have made you targets for elimination rather than just bad intel?" Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, was your team involved in anything classified enough that someone might have wanted you permanently silenced?" The question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Sarah's face went pale as the implications sank in. "Oh, God," she whispered. "What is it?" "The month before we died, we had been working on a special project, something that wasn't part of our regular duties." Jake leaned forward. "What kind of project?" "Marcus never told us the full scope, but we were tracking financial networks, following money trails from various sources to Taliban and Al-Qaeda operations. We had identified several American and European accounts that were being used to fund terrorist activities." Jake felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "You found evidence of Western financing for terrorist groups." "More than that," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "We found evidence that some of the accounts belonged to defense contractors. American defense contractors who were being paid by the U.S. government to fight terrorism while simultaneously funding the same terrorist groups." The magnitude of what she was describing hit Jake like a physical blow. If Sarah's team had discovered evidence of American companies profiting from both sides of the war on terror, that would certainly be worth killing to protect. "Where was this evidence stored?" Jake asked. "Marcus kept copies of everything on an encrypted drive. He was paranoid about digital security, said he didn't trust the military networks with something this sensitive." "What happened to the drive?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "It wasn't mentioned in any of the reports about recovered equipment from the ambush site." Jake was quiet for several minutes, processing what he had learned. The official story of an intelligence failure was beginning to look like a carefully constructed cover-up for something much worse. "Sarah," he said finally, "I think your team was murdered to prevent this information from becoming public." She had come to the same conclusion herself, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that was terrifying. "If you're right," she said, "then talking about this puts us both in danger." Jake nodded grimly. "Probably, but if we're right, then staying silent means whoever did this gets away with it, and it means they might do it again to other teams who stumble onto the wrong information." Sarah looked out at the dark water of the harbor, thinking about Marcus, Danny, Lisa, and Ahmed. Thinking about the families who had been told their loved ones died serving their country, never knowing they had actually been killed to protect war profiteers. "What would you need from me?" she asked quietly. Everything you remember about the financial investigation. Names, account numbers, companies, anything that might help us trace what your team discovered. Most of that information is locked away in my memory, and 3 years of trying to forget has made some of it fuzzy. We'll work through it together, Jake said, piece by piece, detail by detail. Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the determination in his profile, the set of his jaw that suggested he wouldn't let this go regardless of what she decided. This is going to destroy the life I've built here, she said. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, but it might also give meaning to the life you've been hiding from. Sarah thought about her invisible existence, serving coffee to customers who never really saw her, going home to an empty apartment where she spent her evenings avoiding memories and nightmares. If we do this, she said slowly, if we really pursue this, there's no going back. Once we start asking questions, once we start digging into classified information, we become targets ourselves, I know. And if we're wrong, if this really was just a tragic intelligence failure, then we'll have destroyed our lives chasing shadows. That's possible too. Sarah was quiet for a long time, weighing the risks against the possibility of finally getting justice for her team. Finally, she spoke. There's something else I haven't told you. Something I've been too afraid to even think about. Jake waited. The night before I left Afghanistan, Hassan gave me something. Along with the tattoo, he gave me an encrypted flash drive. Said one of the American soldiers had asked him to hold it, to keep it safe until someone came asking the right questions. Jake's heart began racing. Do you still have it? It's hidden in my apartment. I've never looked at what's on it. Sarah, that drive might contain the evidence your team died trying to protect. She nodded slowly, understanding that everything was about to change. If I show you what's on that drive, she said, there's no going back to my invisible life. No, Jake agreed, but there might be a path to something better, something that honors what your team died for. Sarah looked at her tattoo, visible now in the light from the harbor lamps. The names of her fallen teammates seemed to glow against her skin, reminding her of promises made and debts that remained unpaid. All right, she said finally. Let's go see what Hassan wanted us to find. Sarah's apartment was exactly what Jake had expected. Small, sparse, and carefully organized to avoid any personal touches that might trigger unwanted memories. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of a mountain landscape that could have been taken anywhere in the world. She lived like someone ready to disappear at a moment's notice. It's not much, Sarah said, hanging her jacket on a hook by the door. But it's quiet. Jake looked around the living room, noting the absence of personal items, family photos, or anything that might connect her to her past. You've been living like a ghost. It was easier that way, she replied, moving toward a small bookshelf in the corner. No attachments, no complications, no reasons for anyone to ask questions. She pulled out a thick book on Afghan history and opened it to reveal a hollowed-out center. Inside was a small encrypted flash drive, exactly as she had described. Hassan told me it would only unlock with the right password, she said, holding the device carefully. Something about needing to prove I was worthy of the truth it contained. Jake examined the drive, noting its military-grade encryption hardware. Did he give you any clues about the password? Just one thing. He said the password was something my team leader would want me to remember. Sarah moved to her laptop, one of the few expensive items in the apartment. As she inserted the drive, Jake pulled a chair beside her, close enough to see the screen. The drive immediately prompted for a password, displaying a hint that read, "Honor the fallen by remembering their purpose." Any ideas? Jake asked. Sarah stared at the screen, thinking about Marcus and the conversations they'd had. Try follow the money. That was something Marcus said constantly during the financial investigation. She typed the phrase, but the drive rejected it. 2 more failed attempts, and they would be locked out permanently. Wait, Sarah said suddenly. Marcus had a saying he used whenever we encountered corruption or betrayal. He said the only thing necessary for evil to triumph was for good people to do nothing. But he always shortened it to just 4 words. Which 4 words? Good people do something. Sarah typed the phrase slowly, her heart racing. The drive accepted the password and began decrypting its contents. What they found was more damning than either of them had imagined. The drive contained financial records, bank transfers, corporate documents, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of military command and defense contracting. "Jesus!" Jake whispered as they scrolled through transaction records showing millions of dollars flowing from American defense contractors to known terrorist financing networks. "Your team found evidence of treason." The documents showed that several major defense companies were deliberately prolonging conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq by providing intelligence and weapons to both sides. They would receive lucrative contracts from the U.S. government to fight terrorism while simultaneously selling information and equipment to terrorist organizations, ensuring the war would continue indefinitely. "Look at this," Sarah said, opening a folder labeled Operational Oversight. Inside were records showing that Colonel Hawthorne was not just aware of the scheme, but was actively coordinating it from his position in military intelligence. Jake studied communication logs showing Hawthorne had been in direct contact with the contractor's representatives, providing them with classified information about American troop movements, planned operations, and intelligence assets. In return, he was receiving substantial payments to offshore accounts. "This explains everything," Jake said. "Your team wasn't killed because of bad intelligence. They were killed because they had uncovered evidence that would have exposed the entire operation." Sarah opened another file labeled Termination Protocols and found the most chilling evidence yet. It contained a list of military personnel and contractors who had gotten too close to the truth, along with plans for their elimination disguised as combat casualties or intelligence failures. Her team's names were on the list, along with several others who had died in suspicious circumstances over the previous 2 years. The document outlined exactly how their mission would be compromised, down to specific details about the fake village elder and the coordinated ambush. "They planned it all," Sarah said, her voice hollow with shock. "Every detail of that day was orchestrated to make sure we died and the evidence died with us." Jake pointed to another section of the document. "Look here. Your survival was classified as an acceptable risk because you had been assessed as psychologically fragile and unlikely to be believed if you reported anything unusual." Sarah felt anger building in her chest, a rage she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 years. "They killed my team and then made sure I would be too traumatized and discredited to seek justice." But as they continued reading, they found something that changed everything. Hidden in the deepest folders of the drive was evidence that the corruption network was still active. Current financial records showed the scheme had expanded significantly since 2019, now involving conflicts in Syria, Somalia, and other regions where American forces were deployed. "This isn't just about getting justice for what happened to your team," Jake realized. "This is about stopping an ongoing conspiracy that's getting more soldiers killed every day." Sarah looked at him with new understanding. "That's why Hassan gave me this drive. He knew eventually someone would come looking for the truth, and he wanted to make sure they would have the evidence they needed." Jake began copying files to his own secure drive. "We need to get this to someone in a position to act on it, but it has to be someone we can trust completely." "Who can we trust with something like this?" Sarah asked. "If Hawthorne and his network have people embedded throughout military intelligence, how do we know who else might be compromised?" Jake had been thinking about this problem since they first started uncovering the conspiracy. "I have a contact at the Justice Department, someone I served with before he left the military to become a federal prosecutor. He specializes in national security cases. Can you trust him?" "With my life," Jake said without hesitation. "More importantly, he has the resources and authority to investigate something this big without tipping off the wrong people." Sarah closed the laptop and sat back in her chair, processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. "If we do this, if we turn over this evidence, our lives will never be the same." "No," Jake agreed. "But think about all the soldiers who are dying because this network is feeding intelligence to their enemies. Think about the families who believe their loved ones died serving their country, not knowing they died to line someone's pockets." Sarah looked at the memorial tattoo on her arm, thinking about Marcus, Danny, Lisa, and Ahmed. For 3 years, she had carried guilt about their deaths, believing she had failed them by surviving. Now she realized she had survived for a purpose, to ensure their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. "There's something else," she said, opening another folder on the drive. Communications between Hawthorne and his contacts, including plans for eliminating anyone who might threaten their operation. Jake read over her shoulder and felt his blood run cold. There were recent messages discussing him by name, noting his interest in the 2019 ambush and classifying him as a potential security threat. "They know I've been asking questions," he said. Sarah scrolled down to find her own name in the communications. According to the messages, she had been under surveillance since leaving Afghanistan. The job at the coffee shop, her apartment lease, even some of her casual interactions had been monitored to ensure she remained isolated and psychologically stable. "We're both already targets," Sarah realized, "which means we have nothing left to lose by exposing them." Jake nodded grimly. "And everything to gain by stopping them before they kill anyone else." They spent the next several hours copying files and organizing evidence into a comprehensive package that could be presented to law enforcement. As dawn approached, they had assembled a case that would bring down not just Colonel Hawthorne, but an entire network of corrupt officials and defense contractors. "I need to contact my friend at Justice," Jake said as they finished their work. "But first, we need to get somewhere safe. If they've been monitoring you, they might already know about this meeting." Sarah looked around her apartment one last time, realizing she would probably never see it again. "I need to get a few things." She packed a small bag with essentials, including Hassan's photograph, that she kept hidden in her dresser. At the bottom of the drawer, she found something else. A letter Hassan had given her along with the drive, which she had been too afraid to read. Opening it now, she found a message written in Hassan's careful English. "Dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way to light. Your team died as heroes, protecting information that could save many lives. Do not carry guilt for surviving, carry responsibility for ensuring their sacrifice serves its purpose. The American soldier who gave me this drive said to tell whoever came for it that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. Your team showed such courage. Now it is your turn. With respect and hope, Hassan." Sarah showed the letter to Jake, who read it silently before handing it back. "He was right," Jake said. "This is our turn to show courage." As they prepared to leave the apartment, Sarah took one last look at her memorial tattoo. The names of her fallen teammates no longer felt like a burden of guilt, but like a reminder of duty. They had died trying to protect American soldiers from a conspiracy that was killing them for profit. Now she had the chance to finish what they had started. "Are you ready?" Jake asked, standing by the door with their evidence securely packed. Sarah nodded, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. "Let's go honor the dead by serving the living," she said. They left the apartment together as the sun rose over San Diego. 2 survivors carrying the truth about a betrayal that had cost American lives and would cost many more if left uncovered. Sarah was no longer invisible, no longer hiding from her past. She was finally ready to face whatever came next, knowing that her team's sacrifice would not be forgotten or wasted. The memorial tattoo on her arm caught the morning light as they walked toward Jake's car. The names of Marcus, Danny, Lisa, and Ahmed serving as a permanent reminder that some truths are worth any risk to tell. Hassan's gift of evidence and Jake's refusal to let questions go unanswered had combined to give meaning to their survival and purpose, to their pain. Behind them, the coffee shop, where Sarah had hidden for 3 years, stood quiet and empty, a symbol of the invisible life she was leaving behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the difficult work of seeking justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. But for the first time since that terrible day in Afghanistan, Sarah Martinez was no longer just another face in the crowd. She was a witness ready to testify, a survivor ready to fight, and a guardian of truth ready to ensure that her fallen teammates had not died in vain. The conspiracy that had killed her team was about to face the one thing it had tried so hard to prevent: exposure by someone who had lived through their crimes and carried the evidence to prove them. Justice had been delayed for 3 years, but it would not be denied forever. As they drove through the quiet morning streets of San Diego, heading toward a meeting that would change everything, both Jake and Sarah understood that they had found something more valuable than answers to their questions. They had found a way to transform their survivor's guilt into survivor's purpose. their pain into power, and their silence into a voice that would speak for all those who could no longer speak for themselves.